I spent 30 years as a geneticist, and one of the most astounding things to me has been the way that scientists have accumulated techniques, methodology to analyze DNA, the genetic material. And in 2001, geneticists announced the completion of the Human Genome Project, the delineation of all 3 billion letters in the DNA of a single human nucleus. It was an astounding achievement. And to me, the most incredible insight that came from the Human Genome Project was a revelation that 99% of the genes in our cells are identical to the genes in chimpanzees. They are our nearest relatives. The revelation that each of us carries tens of thousands of genes identical to the genes in our pet dogs and cats, identical to the genes in eagles, salmon, fruit flies, dandelions, and cedar trees. All of life is related to us through a common evolutionary history. And surely if the rest of creation is our relatives, they deserve to be treated with greater respect and care than if we simply regard them as resources, as pests, as weeds, or vermin. And in an act of incredible generosity, the web of living things that are our relatives create, cleanse, and replenish the most fundamental needs that we have as animals. It was plants that created the oxygen-rich atmosphere that we depend on for our very existence. Before there were plants and photosynthesis, there was no oxygen in the air because oxygen is a very reactive element, and as soon as it appeared, it would react and disappear from the air. Over millions of years, plants created the oxygen-rich atmosphere we depend on. Life is a critical part of the hydrologic cycle. The first science lesson I remember from grade school was that water covers 70% of the planet, evaporates, forms clouds, rains on the land, runs into rivers and lakes, evaporates. And life is a critical part of that hydrologic cycle. In Vancouver, I believe we have the best water in the world. Why? We get our water from 3 watersheds surrounded by old-growth rainforest. And when that rain hits the ground, the tree roots and the other plant roots and soil fungi and bacteria filter the water so animals like us can drink it. And every bit of our food that we eat for our nutrition to create our bodies was once alive. Life is the very nutrition we depend on. And all of the energy in our bodies that we need to grow and move and reproduce, all of that energy is sunlight captured by plants in photosynthesis that we then exploit. So the point is that the web of living things that scientists call biodiversity, that I call our living relatives, create the fundamental needs that we as animals require to stay healthy and alive. We boast that we are intelligent. Oh, we're a clever animal. But what intelligent creature, knowing the role that air, water, soil, photosynthesis, and biodiversity play in our lives, would then proceed to deliberately and so thoughtlessly pour our most toxic chemicals onto these things, destroy ecosystems and habitat, and drive species to extinction, as if it's our God-given right, and that in so doing, it won't affect us. Scientists can also use DNA in very clever ways to trace the movement of humanity across the planet. And all of the trails lead back to Africa 150,000 years ago. I can't wait to be invited by the Ku Klux Klan in the United States to give a lecture on genetics. And I will show those pointy-headed characters that we are all Africans, because that is where our species was born. Try to imagine the world. Try to imagine the world as it was when our species appeared. There were still woolly mammoths on the planet. There were saber-toothed tigers, giant moa birds, and sloths all over North America. The world was a very different place. If we were to take a time machine and go back 150,000 years and park above the Rift Valley in Africa, we would see animals in abundance and variety beyond anything that we could see in Africa today. And we'd have to look very, very carefully to spot those clusters of 3, 4, or 5 of those funny-looking two-legged furless apes. And that was us. Now, you got to admit, when you think of us in that context, we weren't very impressive. I mean, there weren't very many of us. We weren't very big. We weren't very fast. An elephant can outrun the fastest human on earth. We weren't very strong. A chimpanzee weighing 100 pounds could clean my clock, and I suggest every one of you. And we certainly weren't endowed with any, look at the number of us with glasses. We weren't endowed with special senses of vision or hearing or smell. You got to say, what the heck did we have going for us? I'm sure no other species looked at us and began to shake and said, "What's that naked ape, man? They're going to take over the planet." Of course, the reason we were so undistinguished was that our secret was hidden. It was invisible. It was a 2-kilogram organ buried deep in our skulls. It was the human brain that more than compensated for our lack of physical and sensory abilities. That brain endowed us with a massive memory. No other mammal on the planet has the memory capacity of a human brain. We were curious and we were inventive. And those qualities, memory, curiosity, and inventiveness, more than compensated for the other things we didn't have. That brain remembered from experience, learned through trial and error, and created new ideas that it put into practice. The brain was aware of itself, self-aware in space and time, as no other creature was. We could dream of a world yet to come, a future in which we could avoid dangers and exploit opportunities. Foresight was our great leg up, our great advantage. By looking ahead, we could imagine a future and then work towards achieving it. In only 150,000 years, that strategy worked and brought us to a complete position of dominance. We occupied every planet, and we are now the ruling species on Earth. Consider our numbers. 10,000 years ago, at the beginning of the agricultural revolution, it's estimated there were 10 million human beings on the entire planet. But with agriculture, we then exploded, and in only 8,000 years, by the time Jesus Christ is thought to have been born, there were now 10 times as many, 100 million human beings. And then in less than 2,000 years, in the early 1800s, we reached the first 1 billion people on the planet. We today, in less than 200 years since we reached 1 billion, have now achieved 6.9 billion human beings on Earth. We are now the most numerous mammalian species on the planet. There's a simple rule in biology that our population number of a given species is inversely related to its physical size. In other words, the smaller you are, the more of you there can be. And that makes a lot of sense. The smaller you are, you don't need as much of anything. You can occupy a given area of land with a much larger population. As you get bigger in size, then there are fewer and fewer of you. By the time you get to whales or elephant species, now the numbers reach about in the tens of thousands. Human beings are the most numerous mammalian species on Earth. We're not a tiny animal, we're in between. We have now broken through this biological principle through trade and through technology. We are now the most numerous mammalian species, and just the act of living. Every one of us has to breathe the air. We have to drink water, eat food, clothe and shelter ourselves. Just staying alive, because there are so many of us, means that we have a very big ecological footprint. It takes a lot of land, air, and water to keep our species going. But of course, we're not like mice or rats or rabbits. We have an enormous amount of technology used on our behalf. Just look at each other and look at the clothing that we wear. I'm sure none of you is growing animals to slaughter and get the leather for your shoes, or growing cotton fields in your backyard, or flocks of sheep for wool. We have an enormous amount of technology just to deliver our clothing to us. And then you think of the food that we get that comes from all over the world. And then you think of the TVs and computers and cars. Every one of us, just to live the way that we live now here in Perth, requires a huge amount of technology applied on our behalf. So that amplifies our ecological footprint beyond any other species that has ever existed. And it doesn't end there. Ever since the end of World War II, we've been afflicted with an incredible appetite for stuff. We love to shop. And all of that stuff comes out of the earth, and when we're finished with it, we'll go back into the earth. And that escalates again our ecological footprint. And now we have a global economy that uses the entire planet as a source of raw materials, uses the entire planet to dump our toxic emissions and to pour our wastes when we're finished with these products. And that again increases our footprint. And the global economy hides the ecological impact of all of that productivity on the planet. We go to a store to buy a cotton shirt. I'm sure there are very few of you that ask, gee, is this cotton shirt organic? Cotton is one of the most chemically intensive crops that we grow. And if you go to the Orient, to where the Soviet Union decided to become the largest cotton growing area on the planet, and they did, and now you go to around the Aral Sea, around Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, all of those countries around the Aral Sea, it's an ecologic and a social disaster because they grew cotton in massive amounts. We just buy a cotton shirt, put it on, and we don't think anything of it. You buy a computer, a car, a television set. You don't reflect on the fact there are many, many different metals in these products. Mining is one of our most destructive activities. Do we buy a car and say, gee, where did all the metals in the car come from? What was the impact of all that mining on the local ecosystems? What about the miners? Were they sick? Were they getting a decent wage? What about the communities that support that mining operation? Are they okay? We don't ask any of those questions. We just want our product. We want to use it and get going. And yet the very act of buying these products has repercussions that extend around the world. But when you add these factors all up, when you add up our numbers, our technological muscle power, our consumptive appetite, and our global economy, we have become a force as has never existed in the 4 billion years that life has been on this earth. We are now altering the physical, chemical, and biological features of the planet on a geological scale. Not long ago, a few decades ago, we referred to tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, drought, and forest fires as natural disasters or acts of God. But they aren't anymore. The human imprint is there in all of these events. They're not natural anymore. And human beings have tried to take our place among the gods without God's knowledge to be able to manage the impact of what we are doing. Scientists divide the history of Earth into different epochs, periods of geological time. You know, the Eocene, the Holocene, the Miocene, Pleistocene, and so on. And Paul Crutzen, a Nobel Prize winner, says that this should be called the Anthropocene epoch, a time when human beings have now become a geological force. But now we have scientists and supercomputers to tell us, to look ahead, to act in the best tradition of human beings, using our knowledge and experience to dream of a world, to see the future, see where we're going. And for over 40 years, the leading scientists of the world have been telling us we are headed down a very dangerous path, that there are opportunities from switching directions and finding another road. But now, at this moment when we have become so powerful, we are turning our backs on the very survival strategy of our species. We've got to come to grips with the immensity of our power and our impact on the planet. Even now, I meet people who say, human beings couldn't possibly affect weather and climate. We're not that powerful. We have to be able to see the world as it really is and see our place in that world. And here it's a very difficult challenge. You see, each of us looks at the world and we see the world through our own personal experiences, through our own biases and values. Gender, race, religion, socioeconomic class, these all shape the way we perceive the world. A few years ago, I went to a village high up in the mountains of the Andes in Peru, and I learned that the children there are taught that that mountain is an Apu. Apu in their language means a god. And as long as that Apu casts its shadow on the village, it will determine the fate of all of the people in that village. Imagine how those children, when they grow up, treat that mountain. Compared to a kid in Kimberley who's taught all his life, I'll bet that mountain's full of gold and silver. The way we see the world shapes the way we treat it.